one of the tragic characteristics of the Russian armed forces is they simply, literally, shove people in a meat grinder at one end of their own forces. These men come out mainly and are killed en masse. It's hard to have sympathy for that, but nevertheless, we are not going to be like that. We must make sure that the Ukrainians are trained in the equipment we give them, and we just don't sort of hand them over and let them face the consequences.
Is it time for the UK to lead a coalition of willing NATO allies to secure a UN General Assembly-approved humanitarian zone around the port and territorial waters, with neighbouring international waters policed by an international maritime force?
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to answer questions 5, 14 and 21 together. The UK has committed £1.3 billion for military operations and aid to Ukraine. As part of the delivery of lethal and non-lethal aid in support of Ukraine's military, we are liaising with the Ukraine's armed forces to meet their operational requirements. Most recently, we have announced that we will be providing highly capable multiple launch rocket systems, which will provide Ukraine with significant boost in capability.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the pleasure of virtually meeting Irina, a young member of the European Solidarity Party in Ukraine. Some of the stories she told me of the front line in Ukraine were shocking. Young members of Irina's party, like many brave people, have been on the front line in this fight, some kidnapped and some killed. Could my right honourable friend spell out what steps his department has taken to support all young people in the Ukrainian army during this terrible conflict?
Yes, my honourable friend is right. It's not just about weapons. It's often about non-lethal aid, such as medicines and body armour, etc. And the UK have sent over 200,000 pieces of non-lethal aid, including armour, body armour, rangefinders and medical equipment, and will continue to do so. It's also about making sure that we look at the training that is being given to those young people, because if they're to have the best chance of survival on the front line, we need to make sure not only they are properly equipped, but they are properly trained as well.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the honour to meet a number of Ukrainian officials recently, and the Secretary of State is right that they are very pleased about our commitment with military hardware. He is also aware, of course, that they continue to ask for more. And can I ask him whether any consideration he has had or discussions he's had with allies about providing air capability?
My right honourable friend is right. It's an often request we receive from the Ukrainians and the international community. You'll remember a few months ago the discussion about MiG-29s from Poland. That air is a requirement of the Ukrainians. We've had a number of discussions around the donor conferences that I first convened a few months ago. One or two nations have looked at providing helicopters to Ukraine. I think maybe will be at some stage. Of course, the difference between that type of weapon system and another is the amount of training, and it restricts countries like the United Kingdom because obviously our planes are very different, and therefore wherever we can support provision of air from countries holding Soviet stock, we will do our best.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of Huddersfield and Colne Valley's Ukrainian community, can I thank the Secretary of State for Defence for the magnificent support the UK has been giving to the Ukrainian military forces who are fighting such a valiant fight against the oppressive Russian forces. He's just mentioned the support for the multi-launch rocket systems and the importance of training. How is he balancing the timescales of that, though, with supplying the existing Soviet-era weaponry with the ammunition that it needs for the fight today and this week?
My honourable friend is right to point out the importance of the next step and indeed the requirement for more artillery. The key here is to make sure that the new artillery, which is obviously designed for NATO use, using NATO ammunition, is applied and used in a NATO way rather than just repeating the way the Soviets would have used artillery, because that way you run out of ammunition pretty quickly. That's why we will be sending MLRS. We're also sending self-propelled 155s from a donor, not UK AS-90s, but others, to Ukraine to assist in giving them that deep fires capability, and in tandem helping alongside other countries, especially in the Baltic, in the training of those people to put that type of deep fires into effect.
Martin Day.
Thank you. With reports that medical services in Mariupol are likely already near collapse and the potential for a major cholera outbreak, what discussions has the Secretary of State had with colleagues across government to explore urgent medical relief that could be deployed by the MOD?
The honourable member makes a very important point that the consequence of that Russian brutality and destruction of infrastructure, etc., is the second-order effects, which become things like cholera infections, starvation and indeed other problems. That's why when we have our donors conference, we also make sure we talk about non-lethal aid, and I know my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and others talk across their ministerial counterparts around how we can help in those areas. The MOD itself can't directly intervene in Mariupol, but what we can do is where we can have knowledge and coordinate treatment of people outside Ukraine, whether that's through lift, moving them to hospitals in other countries using our aircraft, we will do that. And then also, I've already spoken to a number of our Black Sea colleagues to see what we can do in places like Mariupol.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At business questions, I raised the issue of the destruction of a depot in Dnipro, which was storing non-lethal supplies, including donations of medicine collected by Claire Anna Mitchell and other constituents from Gower and Swansea. The network organising these supplies is called Never Surrender. It's an efficient and effective deliverer, but they want to work with the government to make sure that they can continue to do this good work. Will the Secretary of State meet with me and Never Surrender to discuss how we can arrange this moving forward?
Yes, could I ask the Honourable Lady to pass on our thanks to Never Surrender and indeed her to constituents. I visited Ukraine last week and saw it's not as easy as people think. It's not only about donating, it is the hours and hours and hours of queues at the border to then get through into the country to then deliver that aid, and it is very grateful. And also, as she points out, the Russian indiscriminate or sometimes deliberate targeting of things like medical support or indeed, as I saw, shopping centres so they could put people out of jobs so that it would put pressure on the economy is the type of adversary we're dealing with. I'll be happy to meet with her. If she wants to meet quicker, can I suggest one of my ministers, as this week and next week is obviously NATO meetings, but I'll be very happy to meet with her or get my ministers to.
Sue MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We fully support all the government's efforts to properly arm the Ukrainians with the equipment and arms that they need. But the Secretary of State has alluded a couple of times to the fact that there's also a corresponding challenge in terms of training. And I wondered if you could say just a little bit more about what discussions he's had, both with colleagues and with allies, about how we maximise the opportunities for Ukrainian personnel to be able to use the equipment and the armoury that most suits their needs.
First and foremost, it is incredibly important that we get the right training to those individuals in the Ukrainian armed forces. One of the tragic characteristics of the Russian armed forces is they simply, literally, shove people in a meat grinder at one end of their own forces. These men come out mainly and are killed en masse. It's hard to have sympathy for that, but nevertheless, we are not going to be like that. We must make sure that the Ukrainians are trained in the equipment we give them, and we just don't sort of hand them over and let them face the consequences. We'll continue to work on that. I'm going to brief his front bench spokesman soon on these topics and what steps can be added. The United Kingdom and a number of our European colleagues are very keen to do more on training. When I have more news, I'll announce that to the House.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If all NATO countries had provided the scale of support to Ukraine as Britain has, there's every possibility that Russian forces will now be pushed out of mainland Ukraine. Instead, we do see Russia consolidating in the Donbass, and now there's every chance that they may be turning their sights to Odessa. If this port falls, Ukraine will be landlocked, further impacting on the cost of living crisis across Europe, including here, because critical grain exports can't get out. Could I ask the Secretary of State, is it time for the UK to lead a coalition of willing NATO allies to secure a UN General Assembly-approved humanitarian zone around the port and territorial waters, with neighbouring international waters policed by an international maritime force? This would ensure the breadbasket of Europe and beyond is able to function and remain part of the Ukraine.
Thursday.
My right honourable friend makes a very valid suggestion and an important suggestion about how we must do what we can to get the grain out of Ukraine. It's not just energy crisis people face, it is food crisis if the Russians are continually able to both steal and blockade that grain. However, I'm afraid, with due respect to my honourable friend, it is definitely easier said than done when it comes to securing that Black Sea and a UN mandate to do that. That's why I am speaking to and have already spoken to a number of Black Sea partners and other members to see what else we can do to explore to get that grain out, both overland and at the sea. And while Russia has talked the talk, they have done the complete opposite when it comes to providing some sort of assurances to any humanitarian corridor, especially on the land, as we saw from Mariupol, and now obviously at sea.
I come to 6, but I'm intrigued why 13 is not grouped.